So again, everyone, I'm Neil McGurk. I'm the Division Disaster Director for the state of Texas. And the purpose of today's call is to really talk about how we assess damage on our disaster action team calls, whether it's a single family fire or a multifamily fire or anything like that. But whenever there's a situation where we actually have to go into a residence to conduct an interior damage assessment. Now, one of the things that we learn in our overall fundamentals of disaster assessment courses and things like that is how to conduct damage after a flood or a tornado or something like that, where you're really taking a quick minute or two to make a visual assessment of the dwelling from the outside. However, what I found is that there's a lot of different techniques and sometimes confusion regarding how we should go about and conduct an assessment following a house fire from the inside. So this is just a quick overview to give you all some tips and pointers regarding the conducting of interior damage assessments. So I'm going to go through this presentation, and I encourage you all to be ready with your questions. We will have a time at the end of the presentation when you all will be able to ask any questions that you like. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So the first thing when it comes to an interior damage assessment is safety. So I can't, before we go into talking about what types of damages and where to conduct the assessments, I want to go over safety issues because one of the primary issues that the DAT teams need to be aware of is how to keep themselves safe and how to keep the volunteers on the scene safe during interior damage assessments. So the first one is you need to coordinate, if possible, your assessment with the local fire department or the resident if it's post-fire. So meaning that if you're on the scene and there's fire departments there, you obviously just don't want to just randomly walk into a home and start conducting an assessment that's been impacted by a fire. There are hazards that are in these homes, and you need to ensure that one, the fire department or the resident has granted you access into that residence. You also need to ensure the power is off. And one of the things that when I've done interior assessments after fires, I always try to tell people, I always play by this rule myself, is never make assumptions that the power is off or that the hazards are minimal or things like that. So you need to make sure that you're communicating with the fire department, with the resident, to ensure that you don't have that the power is still not on, so you don't have any live wires or anything that again could cause harm to you or your fellow team members. The next step is the proper safety equipment. Ensure it's best to have hard hats available for you and your team members, the ones that are going into the damaged home, because again, a fire has drastically changed the interior configuration of the home. There could be parts of the ceilings that have come loose, part of beams and things like that. And so it's always best, again, to ensure you're wearing a hard hat as well as proper footwear. Proper footwear means something with hard soles, whether they're work boots, whether they're other types of hard sole shoes. I find that if you try to go in and do a fire damage assessment in sneakers or some other sort of soft-soled shoe, you run the risk of one, either your foot getting wet through standing water, or being punctured by glass, nails, any other of those types of things. So again, hard hats and proper footwear are a key aspect of ensuring your safety when it comes to conducting an interior assessment after a fire. Also carry a flashlight because the power is off. We all have, not assumed. We've followed up, and the power is actually off, and so you need to carry a flashlight. And it could be, it could be noon, but yet because the power's off, and you're going to need to conduct an accurate assessment, you're going to need to be able to have a flashlight so you can, look into closets, look into bedrooms, and things like that to understand what the damage was actually caused within an individual area. So carry that flashlight at all times. And also, a key important aspect for your protection is to not enter the residence alone. So go with a team member and stay together at all times. So that just ensures overall safety on a variety of different levels for you and your team members. So again, this is a key aspect. Don't enter the home alone. And enter with another Red Cross volunteer or a member of the fire department and stay together during that assessment. And again, before we go on, I do also want to encourage you all, if you have any questions during the presentation, you can ask them via the chat feature and I will answer them as they come up. We also will have an opportunity at the very end of the presentation for any questions that you guys. So as opposed to conducting a damage assessment following a tornado or a flood, there's different types of damage that we have to look for when you're conducting an assessment after a fire, which is typically after a fire is the only time that you're going to be going inside of a house to do an interior damage assessment typically. And so there's a couple of different types of damage that I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to brief you on these very quickly, and then we're going to go through and I'm going to provide you some examples of how to ascertain some of these types of damage types, as well as what that means and what that means for the contents of the home. So direct fire damage is obviously a key component of an interior assessment. There's heat damage, there's overhaul damage, water, smoke, and soot. And I'm going to go through each one of these things. But if you're going to take yourself into a home to do an assessment, these are the types of damage that you're going to be looking for. And it's important that as you're going through this home, through the homes, and which we'll talk about in a moment, that you're really looking for what has been destroyed and what can be salvaged, because as you're going to take the damage assessment that you're doing and going to take that back into the casework process to ensure that we're providing the best possible assistance for the clients. So as we go through this, as we talk through this, I want to keep it fresh in everyone's mind that the purpose of, again, the damage assessment is to ascertain how the family was impacted by the disaster. And this will ensure that you all can have a conversation with the people, with the residents, to one, ascertain how they were impacted and then broach that conversation based on need. So if all of their clothes have been destroyed and they have a verified need that they need to get assistance for that because they have no other way to get clothing, then that is where our assistance will come in. So it's based off the damage and the need. And so we need to be very meticulous in our damage assessment to understand and to take in that need part of the conversation, because that will help us drive those conversations with the clients to determine the best possible assistance that we can provide at the scene of the fire for the residents. So the first one is very straightforward. It's direct fire damage. So it's damage that the fire has burned and it's parts of the home or contents that have been directly impacted by the fire itself. We're not talking about the heat, we're not talking about the smoke or soot, but directly by direct fire. If clothing, if bedding or things like that has been in contact with direct fire damage, then there is no way to rehab those clothes. Or the bedding or things like that. So this is a key aspect of fire damage, and obviously this is something that cannot be easily repaired. The next one is heat damage, and heat damage is kind of tricky, and we're going to talk a little bit about heat damage coming up when we go into the section of where we actually conduct assessments, what physical locations and rooms. But here's an example of, as you can see on the picture of heat damage illustrated by the melted blinds on the floor. So you've got the heat damage, and what really heat will do and really comes into play when we're looking at conducting an assessment in a kitchen and based on the contents of food and things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit more about heat damage as we go into the where to assess and assessing in a kitchen. But in order to ascertain proper heat damage, you really have to look to your environment around the rooms that you're assessing for clues based on how hot the fire was. And the best way to do that is through plastic furnishings. The hotter, obviously, the fire gets, the more likely the plastic furnishings are going to melt, and that's going to leave you those visible clues as you're conducting the assessment. So if you go into this room, you obviously are going to see the melted blinds. You can say that the heat in this room was significant, even though from the picture that we can see here, the room was not impacted, at least in this perspective, from direct fire damage. They've got smoke, they've got soot, absolutely, but no direct fire damage, but still a considerable amount of heat took place in this room. And we'll talk again about how that's going to impact your assessments, particularly within a kitchen. So The next step is overhaul. Now, overhaul, as you can see from this picture, is typically where the ceiling will come down, and you'll bring in the insulation from the attic, from those types of things, down onto the contents in the room below. And overhaul is typically caused by two different methods. One is the abundance of the fire department is spraying water or foam on a home, and it weights down the insulation, which then brings down the drywall and the ceiling, and then brings those contents down into the room below. The other method for overhaul damage relates to when the fire department actually will go down and pull down the ceiling, pull down the drywall, looking for hot spots or venting or something like that. And so both of these situations are a result of overhaul. And what you need to look for when you're assessing the home for overhaul damage is, has particularly the insulation, particularly fiberglass insulation, has that gone and made contact with bedding, with clothes, and things of that nature? Because if you know, fiberglass, and especially wet fiberglass and things like that, will get those glass fibers in your bedding and your clothes, and that's very difficult to rehab and to make those garments and bedding usable again. So that's a key aspect of it as well. And typically, those items are going to be considered destroyed when they've come in contact with the insulation. So again, we've talked about direct fire, we've talked about heat damage, we've talked about overhaul damage. Again, pulling down of the attic materials, the ceiling materials, down onto the room contents below. The next one we are going to talk about, water damage. So water damage, again, relates to, as you can see with this room, both the overhaul. You've got the water that is weighting down the insulation, which then brings down the drywall into the room below. But you also have, direct water damage as a result from, firefighting techniques and suppression efforts. So with this, you really have to have you really have to sort of have a keen eye for, is clothing or is bedding just impacted by water, or has it been impacted by a variety of different damage types? So water alone, obviously, unless it's been stagnating for a while and clothes have gotten moldy, water alone is not going to cause most clothing garments to be destroyed. Now, it depends upon how saturated bedding materials are. Obviously, if you saturate a mattress with water, I mean, you're going to get mold, and the bedding is going to be destroyed. But this is where you have to sort of have that keen eye and not make assumptions and not jump to conclusions, but really do your due diligence in looking as you're assessing the property for those the type and degree of water damage. Again, water that's sprayed on clothing or something like that is going to be different. Now, the other question comes into is foam damage. Some fire departments use different types of foam to suppress fire as opposed to direct water. And these are the kind of conversations you'll need to have with your fire departments to determine the type of foam they're using. There are certain types of chemical foams that do cause chemical residues and things like that on clothing, on bedding, that may make clothing or bedding destroyed, whereas water or maybe a detergent-based suppression foam might not. But this is a kind of conversation to have with your local fire departments to know what their firefighting suppression techniques are and what sort of they're using on fire, so you can better understand how you need to make the assessment. But again, the key aspect of this is that if it's just water alone, especially on clothes, it's not going to be enough to destroy the clothes. They can simply go wash the clothes, dry the clothes, and they should be ready to wear again. But again, if you do have the overhaul, the insulation combined with the water damage, then you're looking at a more significant damage to the clothing garments and the bedding materials that could cause that to be destroyed. So the next thing we're going to talk about is smoke. So smoke and soot damage is obviously going to be the most apparent, especially if you're going into a house that has not completely burned down. Typically, your areas that were exposed to the smoke and soot damage are going to have a significant amount of damage. But sometimes that damage is not going to be to the extent of when you need to consider something destroyed. And now this is where on the smoke and soot damage, and this is the key aspect of the training for conducting an interior damage assessment, because smoke and soot damage is somewhat tricky. First, talk about smoke damage. Smoke damage in some circumstances, depending upon how on heavy or light the smoke damage is, can be, you can rehab clothing and blankets and sheets and things like that, and families can get the smoke smell out of their clothing. And we, with our after the fire booklets and things like that, there are techniques that you can provide and information you can provide to families about how to wash their clothes in order to get the smoke smell out of those fabrics. Now, the difference is on soot damage. Soot is going to be the oily particulates that are going to settle on all open surfaces as a result of the fire. The more soot you have on clothing, on bedding, or things like that, because it is those oily particulates, that is going to be extremely difficult to get out of clothing. Really, you have to send it to a professional restoration in order to get heavy soot stain out, and even that, it sometimes are not going to be effective. And the more that people handle clothes that have soot damage to them, the deeper that soot gets ground into the fabric. One way that I have used in the past to tell if a fabric has been impacted by soot, because sometimes it's difficult to see, especially if you're working in your flashlight or something like that. I'll take the back side of my hand and run it along, bedding or some clothing or stuff like that. And if the backside of my hand comes up with a little with some black soot on it, then obviously you've got soot damage on the clothing. Now, the key aspect with looking at soot damage, because it is damaging to clothing, is the soot is primarily going to impact items that are out in the open. And this is where it is essential that you be meticulous in your interior damage assessments to understand what clothing can be salvaged versus what clothing is destroyed. And so clothing that is shut off in drawers or in a closed closet that has not been impacted by the direct fire is likely going to have less soot damage than clothing that is left out in the open. It might still smell of smoke, but obviously because the smoke is going to permeate into enclosed spaces better than soot, but residents may be able to rehab those clothing items, especially if they're locked in. So this is, as you're doing the assessment, you need to make note of clothing that was in closets, that was in a chest of drawers or something like that, because again, our assistance, and specifically our clothing assistance, is based on does the family members have assistance, have clothing, at least one change of clothing to wear based on what they're currently wearing. So if they have at least one change of clothing to supplement the clothes they currently have on, then we should not be providing clothing assistance to that family. We can provide referrals and other types of things, but our assistance for clothing specifically is related to if they have one set of clothing they can change into based on what they're currently wearing. Or if they're wearing pajamas or something like that, then they have at least two changes of clothing that they can wear. And so this is where it is essential that as you're conducting those interior damage assessments, that you really look to understand the status of clothing. It's very easy to go in and say, well, look, their closet over here has soot damage, and so I'm going to mark all their clothing as destroyed. But in fact, they also have clothes in a chest of drawers that was closed up and may not have that soot stain. So on smoke and soot, this is the trickiest kind of damage that you're really going to look at, especially when it comes to fabrics. So I strongly encourage you all to be very meticulous and do your due diligence as you're conducting those assessments. So the next thing is where to assess. Obviously, when we conduct an exterior damage assessment following a tornado or a flood, we're looking at the outside of the home, and then we're making a quick assessment from there. But as we go into an interior part of a house, there are only a few places where we need to look for and assess the damage. And that's really your kitchen area and your sleeping area. So the first one is the kitchen. And so I took this picture because I think this is a good representation of damage within a kitchen. So we're first going to talk about, as you're going in and assessing that damage, look for a couple different things. So in this picture, you can see obviously we've got smoke and soot damage, as evidenced by the smoke and soot on the walls. You also have overhaul damage. It looks like this. You had one of the firefighters actually, again, either looking for hot spots or anything like that, had pulled down part of the ceiling. So you've got overhaul damage. You also have heat damage. And it's difficult to tell. And I mentioned heat damage can sometimes be tricky. So you have to look at your environment to help tell the clues on how hot it was within the kitchen. And so a couple things that I'm going to look for here. I'm looking obviously at the ceiling fan, which you can see is drooping down a little bit, which is the result, could be as a result of heating. There's also something, could be some sort of detector or a clock or something that looks somewhat melted at the top right-hand corner of the picture. As you're conducting an assessment, the other thing that I always look for in a kitchen is plastic wrapping. A great illustrator of heat damage in a kitchen is, a hot dog bun package or a bread package, something with that thin plastic that you can tell to determine how hot it was within the kitchen. Plastic cups are a great illustrator as well. So go in there, open up the cabinets, and really see how the kitchen has been impacted by damage. Obviously, if you're going to have direct fire, if you're, the soot damage, the overhaul, it's very easy to tell whether or not the food is going to be salvageable or not. But one thing I would encourage you that if you define and find an area where that has had a significant amount of heat in it, as a result of looking for your environmental clues of melted plastic cups or melted melted packaging, then typically that's going to alter the contents of canned food and other types of food to the extent that that food is no longer safe for consumption. So that's going to be particularly helpful when you're looking at situations that has less overt amounts of direct fire damage, water damage, or soot damage. Obviously, this kitchen has a significant amount of soot damage. They've got the heat damage, the overhaul. So this food is likely going to be destroyed. Particularly also when you're looking at the refrigerator. Now, the refrigerator obviously can stay, food within the refrigerator can stay cold for several hours after the loss of power. However, if you lose power and then the refrigerator is subjected to a great amount of external heat, then you're obviously going to raise the temperature within the refrigerator, which could cause the contents of that refrigerator to spoil and go bad, even if it's not directly subjected to that direct fire, water, or smoke and soot damage. So again, in the kitchen, you're really going to look for evidence of that heat and look to your environment to help tell you and give you clues for whether or not you think that food is going to be safe for consumption. And again, when in doubt, always err on the side of the client when it comes to these kind of conversations. And one other thing I should mention is that just because the food is damaged doesn't automatically mean that we're going to be providing assistance to the family for food. Again, the damage assessment is just one component of the assistance of determining whether or not we provide assistance. First, they have to have a disaster caused. They have to have the damage that associates it. So their food has to be destroyed. And then in the casework process, you're going to really ascertain, do they have a need for this food at the moment, or do they have another method of getting access to this? So it's those two things combined. One is the damage that's been conducted that happened within the kitchen, and the other one is through that good casework process is really determining if they have a need for that assistance right now. And so that's when, if those two criteria are met, again, the damage and the need, that's when we can provide assistance financially to the client. So the next step is of where to assess is the bedrooms. And I want to, before I start going into this and looking at this picture here, I first want to mention is that obviously you're going to go room by room looking for bedrooms, But this does not mean, obviously, we have people that don't necessarily sleep in a bedroom. They could sleep on a sofa in the living room or anything like that. So really, as opposed to looking at bedrooms specifically, look for sleeping quarters where people are sleeping. And so in this room, obviously, this room has sustained a significant amount of damage. It looks like, as you can see from the perspective in the foreground, that we've got direct fire damage on it looks like probably the doorway here. The further you look into the room, you've obviously got overhaul as a result of the ceiling coming down. You've got smoke and soot damage. I'd be surprised if there wasn't water damage. And so, obviously, I think we could all agree that the bedding in this room is going to be destroyed. But one thing that you cannot make an assumption until you further go in and do it, I don't know where this person kept their clothing. It could be that if you go off into the left, they had a closed closet in which they kept their clothing, which obviously there's going to be heat damage in there. There's going to be smoke damage. But if the closet door was closed and it was not impacted by direct fire, then you may have a minimal amount of soot damage to the point where those clothes can be rehabbed. So again, this is the part about being meticulous as you're going through the bedrooms and ascertaining what type of damage has been sustained and where people kept their clothes and things like this. The next thing that I recommend, especially when you're going into bedrooms, is if you specifically have a large family, identify where each of those individuals slept and where they kept their clothes in the house. This is, again, part of that good damage assessment. The thorough damage assessment is matching people with sleeping spaces and matching people with beds. And this will help determine and identify how individuals within the homes have been impacted by the fire. Because again, it's not to say, well, in this case, I see the bedding has been destroyed, so everybody in the house gets bedding and everybody gets clothing. No, the clothing and bedding assistance that we provide is made on an individual basis. So if this was John's room, John obviously lost his bedding and may have lost his clothing, but his brother Joe, who slept in another part of the house, that did not receive this amount of damage, obviously is not going to be eligible for the bedding and clothing assistance if he doesn't, one, have the damage associated that causes things to be destroyed, and through the casework process doesn't have a need for that. So keep that in mind, that as you're going through, match up and then work with the clients to match up what rooms, who stayed in what rooms, and where they kept their clothing. We've seen certain circumstances where maybe a household's clothing was all kept in one location. Their bedrooms may have been destroyed, but their clothing was all kept in one central location, like a laundry room or something like that, where their bedding was destroyed. They needed bedding assistance, but because their clothing was not impacted, they were not issued that clothing assistance. So this is a key aspect, and this is why the damage assessment is so important. And it's important not to just rush through it, is to help understand how this family was impacted. And then during the casework process, we can determine the best possible assistance that we can provide to that family based on their damage and based on their. So again, to wrap it up in the providing assistance item here is, again, assistance is provided on an individual basis. So how each individual was impacted by that fire. And then assistance has to be justified by the damage assessment and the verified need. So I've mentioned this multiple times throughout the presentation. You've got to have the damage assessment that reflects that all of their clothing has been destroyed. And again, the clothing based off of a change of clothing based on what they're wearing now. Their bedding needs to be destroyed. And then that needs to be combined with the casework process to determine they have a verified need. So do they have another method at this point that will, another place where they're going to get clothing or something like that? And if they don't, if they have that need, that need at the moment, that is when we can provide assistance. So it's a good damage assessment and good casework that will combine together to assure that we are assisting families appropriately. So the house fires are the number one response that we have at the Red Cross and within Texas. And so the interior damage assessment will really kick that response off well if we do it correctly and if we do it with our due diligence that is required. So we're being good stewards of the donated dollar, and we're providing the best possible assistance to those individuals that have been impacted by those events. So I have had no questions that have come through the chat feature, so I wanted to open it up. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Any questions? Okay, well, the next step will be is
Neil,
the. Yes, go ahead.
sorry. Hi, this is Claire out in Texarkana. So I have a question about the bedding. I was at some point somebody had mentioned bedding. Part of that was mattresses, right? Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, it's your overall.
Okay. All right. So if you have a significant amount of smoke damage, I mean, I understand that you can wash somebody's clothes, but how would you ever get the smell out of a mattress to say that that's a mattress that we don't need to help to replace and can be used again?
Sure, absolutely, and that's a great question. And obviously, a significant amount of smoke damage. It's not a matter of you can't just spray Febreze on it and consider it okay. No, a
Right.
significant amount of smoke damage does will destroy a mattress, and so that's where and that can be part of it. And if your bedding is destroyed, but that significant amount of smoke damage, then typically, in my experience, when you have that significant amount of smoke damage, you also have soot damage as well. That's going to be your majority of types of events. And so, in those situations, that bedding will likely need to be considered destroyed, and that's when, in the casework process, you can ascertain their need and then either provide assistance or work with community organizations or something like that. But you're absolutely right. If there is a significant amount of smoke damage in a mattress, that's something that's not going to be able to get out easily.
Okay. Thank you.
Neil, this is Warren from the East Texas Panhandle.
Yes.
On bedding kits, is that something that's being done statewide, or is that a North Texas region item only?
Sure, that's a good question, and I will say that the bedding kits, for those of you who don't know, the North Texas region is piloting a bedding kit program in which, as opposed to in lieu of direct financial assistance for Class 4 bedding assistance, they're providing a bedding kit with an air mattress and sheets and a pillow and things of that nature. That is a finite pilot that's going to be continued. It's in process now, and the pilot will end at the end of the fiscal year, and then we'll reassess the overall. We'll reassess assess the overall impact of that program. But right now, that's only in the North Texas region, and it's just a pilot. So everybody else is still providing the assistance for bedding based off of the price guide. Absolutely. And I did get a question that came through the chat feature. Someone wanted to know if it was possible to get a copy of this presentation for use in training. Absolutely. What I'll do is, I think from what it looks like right now, the recording seemed to take. So I will be able to render this and get this up to YouTube hopefully today. And but I will also, when I send out the link to YouTube, I'll also send you all just the PowerPoint slides. So if you want to use them, you have that option. Any other final questions? Okay, so expect another email from me later today with the YouTube link and the PowerPoint presentation. But thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your Friday and the weekend.